Thank you very much for that introduction. Can I first acknowledge the Kaurna people and pay my respects to elders past and present? Can I acknowledge Stephen, Hamilton and CEDA for not only thank you for the invitation, but also thank you for your contribution to public debate. Chris said very nice things about me as I walked up. I said, I'm not sure I can reciprocate. I will say this though, he's aged much better than I have, I reckon. Chris is a formidable political operator. He's someone, obviously, he's on the other side, and we've had our debates and arguments and fights, but I will say this, I never doubt his passion for and his loyalty for the state of South Australia. As I said, thank you very much for being here at a very interesting time. I think is it 16 sleeps until the election, not that anybody's counting. And of course, on election day, millions of Australians will stroll into thousands of polling places around the nation. They'll line up outside of school halls, community centres. They'll enjoy fundraising, sausage sizzles and cake stalls. They'll chat to neighbours and friends and strangers, and then in the privacy of a polling booth, they'll make a few pencil marks on a couple of ballot papers. And in this way, we decide, they will decide, who governs the country for the next 3 years. Installing a government peacefully and democratically, thoughtfully and quietly, with typically Australian laconic understatement. And they'll carry out their democratic duty, cheek by jowl with their domestic duties, doing the shopping, running the kids to sports, weeding the garden, walking the dog. But their decision will be no less momentous for being sandwiched between the events of any ordinary Saturday. Elections are important. They're important events in the life of the nation. They allow you, the Australian people, to make democratic judgments and choices, judgments about the performance of the incumbent government and choices about the future of the country. In many ways, our state is at the cutting edge of the judgments and choices to be made on July the 2nd. Our economic outlook is amongst the most fragile of any of the states and territories. And the performance of the government has taken a particularly adverse toll on our state over the last 3 years. The choice between Liberal and Labor will have a crucial impact on our state's future. The federal Liberals' reckless disregard for South Australia over this term has been both unashamed and shameful. South Australians remember a Liberal Treasurer standing on the floor of the House of Representatives goading Holdens to leave. They did, and we know the consequence of that in terms of South Australian jobs. South Australians remember a Liberal Defence Minister telling us our workforce couldn't build a canoe. We remember a Liberal leader promising to build the submarines here, then walking away from it. And we remember the willingness of senior Liberal ministers from the Prime Minister down to cynically and serially disparage management and workers at the ASC simply to try and justify the breaking of the submarines promise. Now, we do welcome the election eve announcement to return to the Liberals' original promise to build the submarines here, and I acknowledge publicly Christopher's role in achieving that. But this belated backdown does not erase all that preceded it. After promising no cuts to health, we've seen Liberal cuts to South Australian hospitals. After promising no cuts to the ABC, we've seen Liberal cuts which have hit South Australia much harder than the eastern seaboard. And after promising no cuts to education, we have seen $2 billion cut from our local schools over the next 10 years. In recent weeks, we've seen Mr Howard visit. And for me, this visit called to mind one of his formulations on how people ought judge an incumbent government. He once suggested that you should ask yourselves a simple question: are you better off now than you were at the last election? So are Australians, and particularly South Australians, better off after 3 years of Abbott and Turnbull? Do they have better living standards, better job opportunities, better economic prospects than they did when the Liberals came to office in September 2013? Well, let's look at the facts. During the Liberals' time in office, the national unemployment rate has averaged 6%. Under the former Labor government, it averaged 5.1%. And the jobs outlook has been worse in South Australia. The average unemployment rate in this state has been 7% under the Liberal government, more than 1.5 percentage points higher than the average under the former federal Labor government. When it comes to wages, wage growth has slumped. The ABS wage price index has grown at an annual average rate of 2.3% under the Liberals, one of the slowest rates of wage growth on record. During our time in government, wages grew by an average of 3.8% annually. And since the last election, living standards have fallen. Real net national disposable income per capita, that is, the amount people have left in their pockets after taxes and transfers, has fallen by 1.4% a year under the Liberals. They increased by 1.1% under us. And since the last election, business investment has collapsed. Under the former Labor government, business investment grew by an average of 6.7% a year. Under this government, business investment has fallen by an average of 8.6% per year. And since the last election, economic growth here in South Australia has slowed. The latest national accounts show state final demand in South Australia grew by 0.5% in the year to March, much lower than the national growth rate. So when it comes to judging the government, I submit that on Mr Howard's own Are You Better Off test, the Liberals have comprehensively failed. And as much as they claim to be the party of low taxes, small governments and strong finances, the facts demonstrate otherwise. Taxes are now higher as a share of GDP under the Liberal government than under the former Labor government. Government spending is higher as a share of the economy, and the budget deficit has tripled. But what of the choice for the future? Well, this election does present a clear choice between alternative visions for the future of Australia, between Labor's fundamental values of securing economic growth with fairness, and the Liberal values of trickle down, which will leave growth stalled while denying fairness to middle and working class people. It is a choice between investments in health, education, skills, productivity and nation building that Labor is putting before you, and Liberal cuts to hospitals, an attack on Medicare and cuts to schools and universities. It's a choice between a Labor agenda of investing in health and education, investments which are good for ordinary people, good for skills and productivity and good for business. And Labor, of course, has an agenda also of investing in infrastructure, which will be particularly important for our economy. And if I can pause for a moment just to outline a few of the investments we're proposing to make in the South Australian economy. First, the 21st century infrastructure of Adelink, an investment which will create some 2,000 jobs, increase demand for locally made steel and improve the economy by tackling urban congestion. The 21st communication infrastructure of the National Broadband Network, an investment to allow local businesses to tap into global markets, unwavering and continued support for the nation's biggest defence manufacturing project right here in Adelaide, and ensuring 50% of Australia's electricity comes from renewable sources by 2030, of course, an area in which our state has a comparative advantage. And today, just a short while ago, I joined Bill Shorten and Premier Weatherill in announcing a commitment to secure 3,500 South Australian jobs and the future of steelmaking at Whyalla. A Shorten Labor government will establish a steel reserve with the South Australian government to secure the long-term future of Arrium's steel operations in our state. We will provide up to $100 million in targeted grants and financing, together with a $50 million investment by the South Australian government, and the requisite co-investment by the company will see $300 million invested in new plant and equipment to make Arrium more productive and more efficient. It is a plan to secure jobs and steelmaking here in South Australia. With investments like these, federal Labor is committed to helping this state, our state, to make the economic transition to a future based on advanced manufacturing, sophisticated services, renewable energy, as well as agricultural exports. So when South Australians make their way to polling places around the state on the 2nd of July, from Coober Pedy TAFE to Narracourt Town Hall, from Lee Creek Area School to Streaky Bay's RSL Hall, I'd ask them to consider their choice thoughtfully. For the way they mark their ballot papers will affect their living standards and their job opportunities, not just over the next 3 years, but for the longer term. It will decide whether the quality of their healthcare will depend on their Medicare card rather than their credit card. It will decide whether their children receive the best possible schooling regardless of their parents' postcode, and whether they face debts of up to $100,000 for going to a university. They will decide whether Australia invests in renewables or whether it continues to devote taxpayer funds to paying big polluters to continue to pollute. And they will decide whether our state is an afterthought, an election eve problem to be solved, or a state front and centre in government decision making. Despite the challenges we face, I am optimistic. I am optimistic about South Australia's future. I'm optimistic about South Australians' capacity to navigate the change we are facing. I'm optimistic about our people's capacity to upskill, our firms' capacity to innovate, our exporters' capacity to grow. But to meet these challenges, we need a government willing to work with us, and a Shorten Labor government will do that. Thank you very much.